Hi everyone. Welcome to the Augusta Baker Diversity Lecture Series here at the University of South Carolina. My name is Nicole Cook, and I am the instructor for a class called Diversity in Libraries, and this is the class that's putting on this lecture series. And it is my pleasure today to welcome Katie Dover-Taylor as our guest speaker. So Katie is a librarian at Westland Public Library in Michigan. And I last saw Katie at a really great two-day intensive workshop put on by the Public Library Association, PLA, and that's a division of the American Library Association. And this a great task force put on this workshop really about issues of equity, diversity, inclusion, and social justice in libraries, public libraries specifically, but a lot of the information is applicable to multiple library types. And so I was very happy that Katie accepted my invitation to come talk about some of this really important work. So thank you, Katie, so much for joining us, and I'm going to turn it right over to you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Cook, and thanks for that introduction, and thank you so much for the invitation to speak with your class. So hi everyone, wherever you are and whenever you are. I'm pleased to be able to talk about something that's really important to me. So let's see. I've been a member of the PLA Task Force on Equity, Diversity, Inclusion, and Social Justice for the past 3 years. We've been doing the work for the past 3 years, and we've renewed the task force. It should go through 2021. A little bit more about me. That's my headshot, and I'm going to mute my video. I am a white, queer, cisgender woman, originally from Detroit. I graduated from a predominantly Black high school. If you're not from the city of Detroit, you may have seen pictures of our spaces that are sometimes called ruin porn, but the city also looks like the picture on this slide. This is actually the conservatory on Belle Isle, which is an island in the Detroit River, and it's actually where I got married on Leap Day. So Detroit is a place of profound contradictions, where both affluence and poverty coexist, sometimes on different sides of the same street. So that sort of informs my understanding of the world. I've been a public librarian in Southeast Michigan since 2010, which I realize is a decade now, so that's cool. In my work, I focus on adult services, especially digital literacy. I teach lots of technology classes. I coordinate computer, smartphone, and tablet classes at my library. I also teach our smartphone and tablet support group, so lots of things related to technology and making sure everyone can use the technologies they encounter in everyday life. I'm also super passionate about anti-racism and social justice in public libraries. And like I said, I've been part of that PLA EDI SJ task force since 2017. So to get started, I thought I'd share a little bit. Looks like to me the slide is a little garbled here, but that's okay. We'll work through it. I thought I'd share a little bit about the work I've done in the past few years. In 2015, my coworker Andrea Perez and I coordinated a track at the Allied Media Conference in Detroit. Hopefully you've had a chance to read a little bit about AMC and the readings assigned to this lecture. But at the time of our first Radical Librarianship track, AMC described itself as a collaborative laboratory of media-based organizing strategies for transforming our world. So AMC started as the Midwest Zine Conference, and it yearly convenes a vibrant community of people who use all kinds of media to incite social change. The conference centers the voices and solutions of Black and Indigenous people and people of color, queer and trans folks, and the disability community. To me, AMC was the most interesting gathering of library work imaginable, and most of it was actually happening outside of libraries, and we wanted to be a part of that. Andrea, who is in the photo here to the far left, is a queer woman of color and also much more visibly queer than I am. Shared with me that she felt alienated by the library world, but she really loved AMC, and we kind of built the track from there. It turned out that AMC was a great place for library workers who felt marginalized within the profession of librarianship to get together. Andrea and I did the track again the following year with some great new coordinators. And then the community continued to grow in the following 2 years, 2017 and 2018, through the Radical Libraries, Archives, and Museums track. In 2020, that Rad Lamb community intends to hold a network gathering at AMC in June called Rad Lamb Stewarding Memory, Culture, and Knowledge for Collective Liberation. This gathering will be a closed network gathering for Black and Indigenous people and people of color, and it's designed explicitly as a healing space for those folks. Because of the COVID-19 pandemic, I'm not sure exactly what the shape of AMC will be this year, but hopefully this network gathering will be able to go on as planned in some form or another. Okay. So in 2017, I co-authored a chapter for the book Topographies of Whiteness, Mapping Whiteness in Library and Information Science. Our chapter was called Disrupting Whiteness, 3 Perspectives on White Anti-Racist Librarianship. And I was joined by Melissa Kalpin-Prescott and Kristen Carriger in writing this chapter. I hope you've had the opportunity to read it, and if you haven't yet, that you will. Our chapter is kind of a good background on how I was thinking about these issues in early 2016 when we wrote it. Melissa, Kristen, and I thought it was important to talk about the different ways each of us can show up to do anti-racist work at all levels. So within ourselves, interpersonally, in our workplaces, in the communities where we live and work, within LIS, and beyond. Since this was an academic book, it was also important to me as a public librarian that public library perspectives were included and that we mentioned the importance of having that conversation about social justice in libraries, about anti-racism in libraries, far beyond what I think of as the echo chamber of LIS scholarship and the academy. And coming to do this lecture is another sort of, intention towards kind of breaking down those silos between academic work, public library work, and the ways we separate ourselves within the library sphere. So that's a little bit about my past work that kind of led me into the task force work that's primarily what I'm going to talk about today. Before I jump into talking about the work of the task force, though, I wanted to mention a piece of library scholarship that informs pretty much everything that I do. Especially in this moment, when some libraries are being kept open, even in the face of a global pandemic, I think it's important that we talk about vocational awe. Vocational awe is a term from Fobazi Itar. It's the belief that libraries are essentially good and sacred and therefore beyond critique. Fobazi is a brilliant librarian, library scholar, currently working as an undergraduate success librarian at Rutgers University, Newark. Fobazi's identities as a first-generation American, queer, and disabled woman of color shape her librarianship, and she's also guided by critical perspectives which aim to deconstruct white supremacy. Fobazi illuminates the tension between the espoused values of librarianship, including equity, diversity, and inclusion, and the real experiences of marginalized librarians and patrons. I will say that I don't think that vocational awe is categorically a bad thing. I think there are some ways in which it can be useful to us, especially in organizing and getting support for libraries. But despite it's not always a bad thing, I think it's really important to be aware of. And I hope in my work that my love for libraries never gets in the way of my ability to demand better for ourselves as library workers, for our patrons and communities, and for our institutions themselves. I think we can't be afraid to engage in the critical, necessary conversation about how libraries can and do reinforce structural oppressions. So moving on to the current work of the Public Library Association. So as Dr. Cook mentioned, the Public Library Association is a division of the American Library Association. It just celebrated its 75th anniversary. PLA's mission today is to enhance the development and effectiveness of public library staff and public library services. PLA currently has about 10,000 members in the US and Canada. In its 2018-2020 strategic plan, PLA named diversity, equity, inclusion, and social justice as both a strategic goal and a core value of the organization. So to PLA, that means that PLA advocates for equity, diversity, inclusion, and social justice in order to enable every member, library, and community group to fully and equally participate in a society mutually shaped to meet their needs. So PLA really wanted to kind of reinforce this idea that equity, diversity, inclusion, and social justice were a baseline rather than something going above and beyond to do. So PLA convened the first task force on EDI SJ, which at that time was just the task force on EDI. After the ALA task force on EDI made its recommendations to the American Library Association, I realize that's a lot of different acronyms, and I hope that you're following me. So our original co-chairs were Richard Kong of the Skokie Public Library and Amitha Lonial, who is currently at the Tacoma Public Library. And they assembled a diverse team, including librarians, library managers, and library administrators. And I think it's important that we have both racial diversity, diversity includes in terms of gender and sexual orientation and ability, but also that positionality within the library hierarchy, I think, has really helped us to do the best possible work. Okay, so our work includes, and again, sorry if this slide looks wonky for you, building community among public libraries through reflection and sharing, developing common language around EDI SJ concepts, including identity, power, oppression, resistance, and solidarity, providing tools and action steps to challenge oppression in everyday lives and work, both in libraries and in communities. So, you know, no big deal. So our work on the task force, actually, sorry, let me go back one slide. So one thing that I wanted to mention is this little story about how we got started. At our first meeting, one of our task force members, Roosevelt Weeks, he's the director of the Austin Public Library. He said that he'd been on many similar committees over the course of his career. And Roosevelt implored us not to have the product of our work be another white paper that would sit on a shelf and never be done. He wanted to make sure that if we were to do this work, we would find a way to really move the needle in libraries. And that charge, I think, it lit a fire under me, but I think a lot of other members of the task force, that we wanted to make sure that whatever we did had an impact. Our first meeting was facilitated by Mia Henry, who at that time was the director of the Arcus Center for Social Justice in Kalamazoo, Michigan, and who now runs a company called Freedom Lifted, which facilitates historical tours in the Deep South. And the task force really wanted to make sure that we tackled structural issues and named them for what they are. So to do this, we decided to lead with race in our work. This framework comes out of the work of the Government Alliance on Race and Equity, or GARE, which I'll talk about in more detail a little later. So when leading with race, we are race explicit, not race exclusive. So we're explicitly using the word racism, but we're not saying that other oppressions don't exist. In fact, we're assuming that each person inhabits multiple identities that affect their unique experiences of oppression as they move through the world. So we're always trying to bring that intersectional analysis, which considers race and gender and religious affiliation and disability status and income and sexuality and so on. While we recognize it's critical to address all kinds of oppression, within the task force we decided to lead with race and racism following the GARE model. We do this because racial inequities are deep, pervasive, and foundational to our country and all of our institutions. We believe that as we work to dismantle racism intersectionally, we also gain tools and experiences that will help us to address other oppressions. So basically, as in the words of Fannie Lou Hamer, nobody's free until everybody's free. Amy Sunny of the Marin Public Library, another member of our task force, captures the importance of leading with race in GARE's report, Advancing Racial Equity in Public Libraries. She says, while race-neutral approaches to library service may seem fair, colorblind or race-neutral practices often reproduce racial disparity, resulting in unfair access and outcomes. The fact that a person's race remains a principal determinant of health, safety, education, and opportunity in the 21st century should compel libraries to focus on race and its impact in our work. So in your diversity in libraries class, you've probably already discussed the incredible homogeneity of the library profession. 87% of librarians are white, 73% of library assistants are white, and nearly 3/4 of librarians are white women. Why is this the case? I think these demographics will stay the same as long as we avoid explicitly acknowledging and addressing whiteness, and particularly white womanhood in our profession. Gina Schlesselman-Tarango, who edited Topographies of Whiteness, is a library scholar who researches the history and present of white women in the library. She talks about what she calls the legacy of Lady Bountiful. According to Gina's research, when librarianship was becoming professionalized, it was thought that feminine traits made white women ideal library workers. These traits included moral and spiritual superiority, the ability to educate, uplift, and civilize, missionary mindedness, and white women embodied the library as a civilizing institution and site of intellectual development, citizenship, and democracy. I'm grateful to Gina for her work in illuminating this legacy within libraries. When one culture dominates a particular space, it may seem like the natural state of things. But your class and my task force are both in the business of questioning. Why haven't these demographics changed over the decades that libraries have been talking about diversity and celebrating multiculturalism? I think many of us have bought into the idea that it's not polite to talk about race. But as James Baldwin said, not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced. So what have we been doing, and what have you been doing to face it? Oops. One thing our task force has been doing is writing about these issues. I hope you all will be able to get your hands on a copy of the most recent Public Libraries magazine from January, February 2020, which was dedicated to equity, diversity, inclusion, and social justice. Our task force now has a column called EDI SJ Matters, and we'll be talking about these issues on the Public Libraries blog too. This article, The Movement Towards Equity, talks about the history and work of our task force and was written by our current co-chairs, Lois Langer-Thompson and Christina Fuller-Gregory. The task force has also produced 2 webinars, currently available on demand through PLA's website. Understanding Power, Identity, and Oppression in the Public Library was presented on December 5th, 2017 by Amit Thelonial, Jody White of ALA's Office of Diversity, Literacy, and Outreach Services, and myself. Advancing Racial Equity in Your Library was presented by Gordon Goodwin of GARE and Andrew Harbison of the Seattle Public Library, and that was recorded in 2018. I would recommend both of these if you're interested in more about these issues. Last year, the task force began piloting regional trainings, which Dr. Cook mentioned earlier. I participated in a training in Chicago as well as Toledo. And these trainings have been facilitated by Mia Henry. After our initial task force meeting in 2017, we found Mia's approach to this work to be so powerful and clear, we thought it was important to spread as widely as possible. During our regional trainings, task force members co-present along with Mia. So in this work, we root in 4 assumptions. Oppression exists. Our goal is collective liberation. We do this work through compassion and accountability, and we all have work to do. I have found these assumptions to be so valuable. And also, I'm grateful to Mia for the deep sigh of relief that I think most of us who go into a room and hear these assumptions feel, because we realize that for the next 2 days, we're not going to have to argue about whether or not oppression is real. And we're not going to play the game of oppression Olympics. We're going to all work together towards collective liberation. So some of the training goals are to build a shared understanding of EDI SJ concepts, including identity and privilege, institutionalized racism and oppression, solidarity and liberation, to increase self-awareness among library workers, help them identify systems of oppression, develop strategies to address bias, and learn how to share this knowledge within their organizations and communities, to develop regional connections that library workers can use to create and sustain transformative work within the library and community. So again, no big deal. We're swinging for the fences. So our upcoming trainings are a little bit up in the air. Our Austin training has already been kind of indefinitely postponed because of the responses across the country to COVID-19. But hopefully some of these will be able to go on, and hopefully maybe some of you will be able to participate in future years or help us to organize bringing a training to your location. So that's kind of a summary of the work of the PLA EDI SJ task force. And I thought in the next few slides I would share some other resources I've found useful when trying to tackle this work in public libraries. So I mentioned earlier the Government Alliance on Race and Equity. GARE is a national network of local and regional governments working to achieve racial equity and advance opportunities for all. GARE, basically, their membership is cities, municipalities, townships, county governments, and there's the people within those places. Some of them are librarians. So within GARE, there's a library interest group, and some of the members of our task force are also on that part of that interest group, like Amy Sunny, who was the primary writer of the Advancing Racial Equity in Public Libraries report. So this report has contributions from many libraries across the country who are trying to put this work into practice, specifically racial equity work, and they use the GARE equity framework. So that framework involves 3 strategies that overlap. Their strategies are normalize, organize, and operationalize. So when normalizing, they're trying to cultivate high-level investment in this work within the community. They're establishing internal change teams within their institutions. While organizing, they're building capacity among library staff and stakeholders. And they're also partnering with other institutions and communities in their area. When working to operationalize, they use racial equity assessment tools, which are developed and provided by GARE. And they also create racial equity action plans. And there are examples of how this work has been done in libraries across the country within the report. I think that this framework can be especially useful to library administrators who are trying to wrap their heads around what they can actually do to promote racial equity in their libraries and communities. As a non-supervisory staff person, I've found it a little bit harder to engage with this framework, but you may find it useful as you go through your library career. So here are some readings that I have found particularly useful. You'll notice Dr. Cook's textbook here. I mentioned Topographies of Whiteness earlier, but I also recommend Pushing the Margins, Women of Color and Intersectionality in LIS. And while you're checking that out, also take a look at many of the other titles from Library Juice Press. Again, I find Fobazi Itar's work and this piece from In the Library with a Lead Pipe as foundational to what I do. I also recommend At the Intersection, which talks a lot about diversity. This is a blog from April Hathcock, who's a librarian at NYU. If you're interested in collections, I really recommend the Zine Librarian's Code of Ethics, which was a collaborative work from a bunch of different zine librarians who were trying to think through the implications of putting print materials that were often from marginalized communities online and the ethics of doing that. And then central to everything for me, a book not often associated with LIS, Sister Outsider by Audre Lorde. This collection of Lorde's essays and speeches is a book I think everyone should read. And because I'm a white woman and have found it so challenging and essential, I especially recommend it to white women who are interested in anti-racism and social justice work. Please read it. So, of course, conversations about equity, diversity, inclusion, and social justice in libraries are ongoing. Here are a few communities I wanted to highlight. The We Here community is a coalition of librarians and library workers of color dedicated to mutual support and career growth. They've recently crowdfunded and have created a publishing platform called Uproot, which I'm looking forward to following. Renewers is a Facebook group facilitated by Katrina Davis Kendrick for people who identify as recovering from low morale in library environments. Davis Kendrick is a scholar who researches morale in libraries and facilitates a discussion about how to improve conditions for all library workers, including workers with marginalized identities. Query Librarians is a community of queer librarians organizing parties and events in support of queer libraries and archives. LIS Microaggressions is a blog and zine series that documents the slings and arrows wielded against librarians of color by their colleagues. And CritLib is a Twitter hashtag and discussion community for critical librarianship, which I'm sure many of you are already familiar with. As we work to make libraries more diverse, inclusive, equitable, and just, I think we can learn a lot from library work done outside of our profession. I loved this piece in Places Journal called Fugitive Libraries, which talks about how Black communities have created their own independent itinerant libraries. I've also had the pleasure to meet Ola Ronke, the creator of the Free Black Women's Library in Brooklyn. The Free Black Women's Library is a pop-up project with over 1,000 donated books by Black women which springs up on stoops, at festivals, in barbershops, at parks, and galleries to provide free books and space for performance and discussion about the lives and art of Black women. I think AMC, which I spoke about earlier, is also a good example of organizing being done at the margins of the library profession. And I also want to hold up the work of Critical Path Learning Center, which began as the AIDS Library of Philadelphia FIGHT. Critical Path is an educational commons and stigma-free space devoted to health and digital literacy. This is a library co-located within a community health center, open to all, but centering the needs and experiences of people with AIDS and HIV positive status. So hopefully I didn't talk too fast or too slow for you, but that's my perspective on equity, diversity, inclusion, and social justice in public libraries. I can take questions now. Hopefully Dr. Cook has some good ones. If you'd like to chat with me or follow up, please feel free to email me. My email is dovertaylor, my last name with no hyphens, @gmail.com. And I really just want to thank Dr. Cook again for inviting me to speak, and for all the work that you do to move the needle in our profession. Thanks.
Thank you, Katie. This was a great session. Thank you so much. So I have a couple of questions for you, and I will invite the students in the class to certainly reach out to you if they have any questions.
Awesome.
And also for you, Katie, we are on Twitter. We have Twitter chats every couple of weeks.
Oh.
And so I'm going to put my handle in there. So if you look for my handle at Baker Chair, and it's usually these two hashtags. I'm just going to type these in here. So this is for you.
Fabulous.
Right, and also for the students. So if you'd like to, pop in, you're more than welcome anytime. And then for the students in class, if you have any specific questions for Katie after you watch this recording, stick them in Twitter, and we can certainly let Katie know there's some questions.
Yeah, awesome.
And some discussion. Yeah, so let's do it that way.
Cool.
So that would be
That's
good.
Great.
Yeah. I wanted to know if you would talk a little bit more about Vocational Awe. And, right before we got online today, we were talking about, in particular, the Chicago Public Library that is still open during the coronavirus crisis, if you will. And so, obviously, information and things are happening so quickly, it's hard to keep up with. And it feels like, even in the beginning of this week, it's Thursday today, even on Monday, things were very, very different. And so initially, there were a lot of large public library systems still open. Philadelphia, Houston, Los Angeles, New York Public. And it seems like now, as of today, all of the larger public library systems are closed with the exception of Chicago Public. So then there's been a lot of talk on social media and a lot of really upsetting, I would say, messages from some of the folks that work at CPL saying that they don't feel safe. And I know that there are a lot of academic librarians that are definitely in the same boat. And there are many, many academic libraries that are also still open, and their librarians and staff are saying the same thing. So I wanted to know if you could talk a little bit, maybe not necessarily about Chicago, but just in terms of, what does it look like for us to really talk about and advocate for social justice for us in the profession, right?
Yeah. Wow, awesome question. Thank you. Not surprising that you have good questions, but wow. I mean, so I have so many thoughts on this. Chicago is closing, I think, 61 branches, but keeping 20 open. And there's been some, like, a bunch of organizing by the remaining library staff and their union to try and get the library to close. I know there's been some sick outs, some organizing in that way. When my library closed at the end of business last Friday, we had a meeting of all the staff who were there that day. And our director said he had been speaking with a bunch of different directors across Michigan. And one of them said to him that, there are some times that library services are not as important as public health. And this is one of those times. I wish that was sort of a universal expectation, right? That there are times when, yes, what we do is important, but it's not as important as the safety of all of the people who come into our libraries, including the staff. But I mean, I think what's interesting is that we see the limits of vocational awe. So we see that in times like this, the importance of the library is being held up. But maybe that importance wasn't so clear at the time when we were receiving funding, or we were setting budgets, or we were deciding how much to pay our staff. So I think there's some contradictions there when it comes to how we consider the importance of library staff and the people who work there, as well as the importance of the services that we provide in the community. And I also think it's interesting that I understand wanting to keep buildings open to allow people a place to go, a place to connect with the internet. But I think, most public health officials will say that that's the reason that we're social distancing, is so people aren't connecting, right? And that the people that we're most concerned about creating access for, like the vulnerable and marginalized people in our communities, are often the most susceptible to something like, this virus. So I don't know, it's tough. I am seeing some of the work that you're talking about on social media, with people really trying to make sure that the libraries are closed, that we aren't providing a vector for this virus to spread. But I think it really is showing some true colors. And it makes throughout, the week before my library closed, as you said, like, we're seeing all this information all the time, and everything seems to be changing, like, hour by hour, minute by minute, day by day. The week of uncertainty before we closed was a really hard time. And, we talked about how we could possibly sanitize and what we could do. But the reality was there was no way we could do enough, even if we were kind of like making ourselves crazy trying to do it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you for that. It's certainly a hard one. And I know online I've been seeing people, and there's like I said, lots of library systems. I've been following another librarian in Minnesota who's having similar issues, and some of the things, the conversations they've been having, and some memes that have been coming out about this, saying, when you're on the job market, pay attention to the libraries that stayed open, and pay attention, to how they treated their staff. And, lots of issues, as Katie mentioned, in terms of, are folks being paid if they don't have to come in? Does this apply to administration? Does it apply to librarians? Does it apply to non-librarians, meaning the library technicians, the assistants, all the other folks that keep the libraries running? Does it apply to the part-time staff, right? So there's lots of layers and nuance, and a lot of libraries aren't unionized, so they don't have the extra layers of assistance. But I think that is definitely something to keep in mind. But the librarian that I mentioned in Minnesota, she also said, this is a very unusual moment in time where people are caught unawares, and it's not to say that people in libraries can't do better, right? So if you're going to ask that question, don't just rule these places out and assume that they can't learn from this episode, right? So the question really that you should be asking is, what are you doing now? What are your policies and procedures that you have put in place so if there's another emergency or pandemic, what are you going to do, right? So,
and also, what did you learn, right?
absolutely, because and I think that's a great point, because if they didn't learn anything, that's all you need to know.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So one other thing on the union point is I think I mentioned that I'm the chair of my library staff union, and we actually went through a pretty intense unionization process over my time at the library. I've been at the library for about 7 years, but we finished bargaining for our first contract about a year ago. And a first contract is, it's a really tough thing to do. You're making something from scratch. But we had enough problems with like snow days and questions about like whether we were in or out, that we really pushed for making sure that if the building is closed, our staff gets paid. And I'm really actually super proud of that, because it meant that our library administration didn't have to make a hard choice, right? They didn't have to try and decide, if protecting the bottom line was more important than the staff. Like that was already there. So I think, I don't know, just a plug for unions and continuing to try and get those protections for everybody.
Absolutely. So I guess this is a follow-up question that just occurred to me. What would your suggestions be for the students that are going out into libraries? Quite a few of the students are already working in libraries. If they don't have a union, what are some things that they can do to advocate for themselves, whether it's in relation to EDI, and certainly not always related to a pandemic, but what are some other ways?
Right. We're assuming that at
not.
some point there will be a different time. Yeah.
Exactly. We're going to go back to quote unquote normal.
Right.
But what are some other ways that they can advocate for themselves and for their diverse communities?
Yeah. So I would say first that you never want to act alone. Um, I think that the what we learn from unions, from the history of unions in this country, and also from the laws that protect the formation of unions, is that collective action is the way to get things done. And in places where we individually don't seem to have much power, when we connect with other people and collaborate towards getting a specific thing accomplished, we are much more powerful than we would have been, no matter how eloquent we are. The Public Relations Act, or the National, I can't remember the exact name of the law, but I will say that concerted activity to improve your workplace, again, with other people, is protected under the law. And I'm pretty sure that's a national law. I know that some regions are more historically amenable to unions than other places. The Midwest, where I am, is, UAW and Teamsters and all of that. Like, we have a rich history with unions. I think the South, it's much less of a thing. And I want to be aware of that and not kind of give a blanket, like, this is what you should do. I think in terms of organizing around EDI, it's kind of similar to organizing to protect the library staff. You really want to analyze your particular context, because every context is different. You want to understand the political landscape where you are, who actually holds the power. It's not always the people who have the position or the title. Might be the people who influence those people. And then you have to figure out what those folks' ambitions are and what they're trying to accomplish, and how you can align what you're doing with the goals of the folks that can help you get there.
Right.
Does that make sense?
No, it does. It does. And I think I was just thinking to the first thing you said about not working alone. And I think that that is sometimes not necessarily the temptation, but sometimes people feel like that's what they have to do. They feel like they are alone and no one else is having these types of difficulties. And it's very easy to be isolated and not know that there are like minded individuals and professionals, whether it's
Right.
locally, nationally, et cetera, that are interested in the things that you're interested in. And it's always better. And not always easier, but always better to,
Yeah.
have some allies and have some co-conspirators
Yeah.
in this work, because that's what's going to make it worthwhile and hopefully lasting.
Yeah. It's
Yeah,
so exhausting to feel alone. I mean,
it is. It really is.
that's what it comes down to.
Yeah.
And I think that been the value for me of going to AMC and seeing how many people were excited and inspired by thinking about libraries and media-based organizing together, by having these regional trainings. And those moments of being able to connect around these issues and understand that you're not alone are really nourishing.
Hmm.
And I think one of the goals for me in the task force is making sure that as many people get access to those moments of connection and nourishment as possible.
Hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And you know um, your work is also a great example of, you don't always have to do this work within the LIS domain, right? We certainly want to benefit our own profession, um, but it doesn't have to be done within those confines. You can certainly,
Mm-hmm.
do that work in other organizations and in other spaces, and bring that back. And to
Yeah.
Katie's point, getting that nourishment wherever you can to be able to come back and do that work in your library, in the profession. I remember years ago going to NCORE, which is the National Conference on Race and Ethnicity. And it was just a huge deal to be able to go to NCORE and see, like, literally hundreds, if not 1,000 plus people talking about race and ethnicity in the same ways that I was thinking about it. And I
Mm-hmm.
really was able to kind of mobilize that new energy, and bring it back to some of the work that I was doing. So definitely, look at other avenues, interdisciplinarily, if you will, to do some of this work. So, Katie, the last question I have for you,
Yeah.
you mentioned, you were talking about GARE, and I think that, they're doing some amazing work, and I think it's amazing that they have been so willing to partner with libraries and things of that nature. But to your point about, maybe it's not as accessible or as, let's say, relevant if you're not in an administrative or leadership position, or, in some places, librarians are, you know, uh, counterparts to city managers, and just very different structures across the country.
Mm-hmm.
What For folks who are not necessarily in those types of positions, is there something else you could recommend, another resource or avenue, or how have you kind of, let's say, readjusted the GARE materials to work for you and what you do?
Yeah. So I think a lot of the other resources that I've recommended, I think of as more like, I don't want to say entry level, but kind
Hmm.
of for everybody.
Hmm. Hmm.
One thing that one of our task force members, Jessica Bratt, was kind of involved in organizing, was Project Ready,
Hmm.
which I realized as I was getting things ready today that I should have mentioned in my slides. But that is a toolkit for, I think it's designed for school librarians,
Yes.
and librarians that serve young people.
Hmm.
But I think that some of their, it's basically like an online course that talks through some of these issues, and I think it's designed to be accessible to people from all aspects of library work. So that's something that I would also recommend.
Hmm.
And I think that it's also really important to remember that there'll be times that you have to step back from this work, in order to be able to keep doing it. So that's something that I also recommend doing, is Find the things outside of this that give you joy, that give you life, and focus on those things too, you know.
Absolutely. And it's very important, especially as most of us are home isolating.
Yeah, I'm trying to take my own advice.
Right, right,
Not
right.
eating.
Because now we're home isolating. We're like, what are those things that we really
Right,
enjoy, right? So,
right,
but
totally.
that is a great note to end on. And so I just want to thank you, Katie, again so much for coming in to share your expertise. So much good food for thought. And it's always really important, I think, for the students to see some of this work in action. And so certainly the work that you're doing is a great example of that. So thank you for sharing with us.
Thank you so much for having me.
Absolutely. All right. Thank you all for joining us today, and we will return with another installment of the Baker Diversity Lecture Series very soon. Thank you again.
Have a good one, everybody.